Welcome back to Beyond the Bit Quantum Pathways. I'm delighted to be joined again by Brian Lenahan for a second session, this time moving from his past into the present and the future. We start with his recent TEDx talk on the transition from AI into quantum and the message that when one door closes, another opens. From there, we get into the talent gap. That's now one of the biggest challenges in the field, the workshop he ran for people wanting a way in, and his moderating work with the Quantum Insider on agentic AI and quantum. We finish on where the industry is heading, from scalability and error correction to why the old timelines are shrinking fast. There's a lot in this one, so let's get into it. Hi, Brian. Good to see you again. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Amir. So happy to be back.
No, thank you so much. I know you've been super busy, and part of this is I've been kind of following what you've been doing. And when we did the last podcast, I was like, I'd love to get this series going and seeing what you've been talking about, etc. So I really welcome the opportunity for you to come back and tell me where we've been. And I think with the last podcast that we did, it was kind of, as you mentioned, it was your past coming up to the present. And I thought what I'd like to do now is talk about the present and the future. And I think that gives us quite a nice arc into the life of Brian Lenahan and what's happening with you and quantum. Obviously, this is going to be a bit of a quick fire question because I know what's happening, but I'd like for you to explain to the audience and so on, if that sounds good for you.
Absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. Right, I'd like to kick off with your TED Talk. So I know you've recently done a TED Talk, and I know obviously from previous conversations that you spent a good few months preparing for that. I love TED Talks. I'd just like to know the process behind that. Tell me about the talk and how it went.
Well, I've never been involved in anything as disciplined and structured as a TED Talk. We started off in January. I got the invitation to come and speak. And by the way, this was at Lakehead University, which is in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And so knowing it was going to be a university-based audience also helped me change, sort of structure my message. But working with the TEDx team, I met every 2 weeks. They reviewed my script. They reviewed all of my deck material. We talked about how to dress. We talked about, who was going to be there, the audio visual capabilities. It was way more structured than anything I've been involved in up to this point. And, when you got to the actual day, you could tell. We did a full rehearsal the day before. You had to go all the way through your speech. And, for me, the way I do it is I don't memorize. It's a storytelling exercise for me. And hopefully you'll get to link the TED Talk, which is on YouTube, in the bottom of your video or a bit at the bottom of your podcast. But when we got to the actual day of the TED Talk, it was such a diverse group of discussions. One young lady was disabled and she talked about how she moved from, her initial condition to where she is today, and it was very inspiring. We had people talking about AI in the medical industry and myself talking about quantum. And so, the audience got a real good variety of it. But I even had people coming up to me afterwards saying, listen, how can we integrate your message into our academic programs?
Mm-hmm.
So it was very, very exciting to be part of the TEDx.
So what was the talk about? So as far as I know, it was obviously quantum and AI, I believe.
It was. So the premise for me was really reading the media, whether it's social or mainstream, and all of these large companies, Google, Meta, Amazon and others, and these are all public records, who were eliminating entry-level jobs by the tens of thousands.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you're aware of that.
Yeah.
And so my thought was, okay, is there a message of inspiration that I can share with this group? And of course, one of the things, obviously being involved in both the AI and the quantum community, you see both groups and how they're progressing and how the momentum is changing. And back in December 2025, the Quantum Insider, which is essentially, one of the top 3 sources of information in the quantum industry, published an article that said by 2030, there'd be about 250,000 jobs available in the quantum community. And by 2035, there'd be
Mhm.
about 840,000. And those jobs aren't necessarily just physicist jobs. They can be in marketing. They can be in engineering. They can be in leadership roles, all sorts of different ways that people can contribute. And so my message at the TEDx talk was, when one door closes, the transition from AI to quantum. And my goal there was to inspire at least one person to change direction,
Mhm.
to start thinking about how they can get involved into the quantum space.
And why do you think that? Sorry, in terms of the AI and quantum, why do you think that shift's happening?
Because, things like AI agents can do the work 24/7.
Yeah,
They can do it faster.
yeah.
They can do it cleaner. And, assuming you've implemented those AI agents correctly, and it's not just email or scheduling, it's so much more, that agents can work, whether it's semi-autonomously or autonomously, inside an organization. There are even some experts saying that if your organization isn't 80% agentic, you're not going to be competitive, assuming that there's going to be a big creative or judgmental area that humans continue to be involved in.
Hmm.
And so that leaves those people who are just graduating from a university degree, maybe in computer science or a master's in computer science, who assumed that they were going to move into a programming or a coding or, kind of algorithmic type of role, all of a sudden realizing that those entry level jobs aren't available.
Yeah.
And so my point was, there are billions and hundreds of billions of dollars that are being invested in the quantum space, all being driven for good reasons, which we'll talk about later, but being invested in that space. And so the challenge is no longer the funding aspect of quantum. It's the talent. It's the lack of resources.
Well, I hope so, because that's the field I'm in.
Well, I can suggest to you that that is a worthwhile endeavor.
Then, I also know that you ran a workshop following the TED Talk, and I think it was about 40 odd people. So can you tell me a little bit about that, or rather, not me, rather the audience?
Well, I was thrilled that I had the opportunity. I was one of two workshops that were involved in the day. And so I did my TED Talk presentation in sort of mid morning, and just around lunchtime, they gave me the opportunity, and 40 people walked into that room. And I was talking about taking it to the next level. If you're interested, here are the tactics involved in learning about quantum technologies, where you need to start, do you have Python? Do you know where to find the YouTube videos? Are you aware of certain academic programs that are available? What sort of pivots can you do to get into the Qiskit community, for example, of IBM and various other kinds of communities? So very tactical. And it was clear that this was a group of young people who were looking for, so you say it's an opportunity. How can I get there? And Amir, I got to tell you, I was so thrilled because every single one of those 40 people walked up to me at the end of that session and asked more questions.
I love that. I love that, and that's the whole thing. My podcast is when I said it's about quantum pathways. So that's what it's about. How do we get into this field? What roles are going to emerge? And we're kind of looking past perspective based on, like, I know you've done a lot in the AI space prior to AI really taking off. It's like, okay, what did we learn from that, and how that's changed, and how can we look at quantum and what's coming next? So I truly love that. So that was a good moderating session. You mentioned the Quantum Insider. I also know you moderated a session for them as well, and you mentioned agentic AI earlier. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So let me start with the Quantum Insider. So over the last 2 years, I've moderated at least half a dozen of their webinar sessions where they work with a quantum vendor and a series of experts in a certain field to talk about, quantum subjects that I think that are important. So we talked in that one about, is agentic the path to quantum success? And it was a really good conversation, particularly because one of our experts said, no, it's not the path. And so, you want that kind of, clarity and transparency. It's not the only tool to success. It's just one of the tools. And so, when you're thinking about investing time into quantum algorithms or, how much you're going to offload to an agent, it's so important to have that kind of perspective to say, okay, so it's a tool I can use, but I really need to be aware of all the other things that are going on. And that's one of the great things that Quantum Insiders is good about, is bringing these questions to the fore without any hype, without that kind of thou shalt or thou needs to buy.
Yeah.
And so I've been doing a number of these moderated sessions. And it's great for me because it's a challenge, as preparing for a podcast or preparing for a webinar moderation, you really do need to know the subject to some extent. And so that's where I love doing these webinars. It challenges me. It pushes me to learn more. And I want to make sure that the people who are on my panels know that I've invested and respected their time.
Yeah. Yeah. And how did the room respond to that?
We had over 400 participants on the webinar. People, and we love to do it in a multimedia sense. And what I mean by that is we have an ongoing chat on the side of the screen. We have polls. There are questions that I'll pull and ask the panelists during that time, so people feel really involved in the webinar rather than just sitting back and listening. And people from all over the world, every part of, the Middle East, Asia, Europe, North America, South America, etc. So it's great to see that kind of geographic distribution of interest in quantum as well.
Mm-hmm. And is that webinar available to the general public to see?
Yeah, if they just go use the Quantum Insider, and HaiQ, HAIQU, is the most recent webinar posted again on YouTube.
Excellent. And once again, I'll post links to all of this in the comments, etc. Now, that kind of pulls us into, like you mentioned, different countries around the world. That's what I wanted to talk to you about, was sort of national strategies and quantum. And I know QSI, which is your institute, has been preparing national strategies, a report, I think, over the summer. So, and we talked about this previously. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. Last year we did our first national strategies report, and it really just sort of scratched the surface. But I'll tell you, from my perspective, one of the things that I've heard about many times over the years is inflection points. When is the industry changing and how is it changing? And not necessarily ChatGPT moments either, because that was a massive sea change in the AI world. It became a consumer product. I'm talking about inflection points, whether it's a breakthrough in a technology or it's a significant shift in the drivers of quantum. And so one of the things that we are talking about a great deal is 2027. And in particular, the moves made by countries like France, who has mandated that all software vendors who work with the French government must have post-quantum cryptography layers built into their software by 2027. Mm-hmm. And that's a massive sort of support for the industry as a whole, saying that this is real, it's important. And not only is it important, you must have it in place. And so, people who are sort of in the more consumer area are expecting to have those available to them by 2030. But, if you're working with the French government, that's a mandate. But not only the French government. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was going to say, there's a couple of things on. When a government pushes a strategy like this, how quickly does that become a real operational problem inside companies?
It absolutely does, because number one, the awareness has heightened substantially, saying, why are they doing this? Mm-hmm. We aren't even looking at quantum. Why is this French government doing this? And so that now they have to invest resources into saying, okay, so if they're so concerned about post-quantum cryptography, and we don't have anybody on the inside who is aware of quantum, writ large, let alone just, how it is going to be adopted inside a company, let alone prioritizing it on a budget with inside our company, we need to get started. And hopefully those people are really, truly listening and acting.
Yeah.
In my experience, it's still a gradual progression, but certainly leaders of the largest companies are there.
I was going to say, are boards ready for that pace?
I've had a number of conversations, number one with boards, but number two on podcasts about boards. And so, we know what the boards need to be doing in terms of, pressing their executive teams for a roadmap. Tell us what you're doing, even if it's not complete. Tell us what you're doing. This is what the Canadian government did to all of their agencies. By April this year, they said you must have a roadmap in place, not necessarily starting the implementation, but at least a roadmap. And that's what boards need to be doing. But I would say to you that 99%, and maybe we mentioned this last time, 99% of all companies are small or medium. And very few of those companies are starting down this path.
So that's quite aggressive timelines, considering. And also, I know, obviously, we had the US executive orders land in the last few weeks as well. So can you tell me, give me your perspective on that? Because obviously ties into what I was talking about, national strategies.
Yeah, so two big buckets of executive orders. One, not surprisingly, is around post-quantum cryptography and how the U.S. government is ensuring that all of its agencies are actually integrating post-quantum cryptography. I think 2030 is sort of their timeline for, having all those things in place. But that they are going to be pushing that agenda quickly. But they've also put the money behind it, to make these things happen. The awareness has all of a sudden gone up significantly within the United States. So that's number one. And the other one is around more the commercialization aspect of it. So what applications, life sciences, health sciences, other optimization capabilities, putting money in and strategy towards that, but also trying to bring all the various different agencies around the American government in alignment. And so understanding who's really running the quantum strategy and which groups are feeding into that. So huge steps forward. But, the other part is the non-governmental driver of quantum technologies. And to me, that's the iterative progress of what's happening in the lab. And it's making a huge difference.
So obviously mentioning France and the US, that kind of brings us into an area that I've been thinking about quite a lot, is sovereignty and uncertainty. And I know your QSI board have been looking at that. So I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that and how that's all kind of moving. Can you unpack that for us?
Absolutely. I mean, and you're absolutely right. In my last conversation with the QSI board, they were very interested in, where are countries with their sovereignty approach and how are they differentiating? And so, for example, in October, I'm going to a security summit in Vancouver, Canada. And the focus on that is sovereignty. So countries are not looking outside their borders for the security. They're saying to themselves, how do we ensure we are secure? And from a cryptography, cybersecurity approach, do we have the resources internally? Mm-hmm. But also, what are happening in terms of standards worldwide? So some regions are pushing quantum key distribution much more actively than they're pushing post-quantum cryptography. And so what does that mean? But also, if you think about what's happening in, Europe and your neck of the woods, particularly in the EU, they've always been very strong with standards, regulations, for some people to the point where it slows down innovation. But at the same time, really structuring what it looks like. So maybe that's through IEEE, or some other sort of standard setting organization, or through NIST in the United States. So we're starting to see those being built out. The question that I always get, Amir, is, why are we worrying about a technology that may be 10 or 15 years away? And that's the wrong question to be asking.
Yeah.
That's in my mind.
Yeah, 100%. When you talk about that, I've seen, and we talked about it, a lot of countries are now kind of looking to pull data back on shore. We mentioned France, and I know they're reportedly banning Microsoft products. Others are stepping away from tools such as Palantir and databases overseas. Do you think that's a security story, a trust story, or a control story?
Well, I think it's a bit of all of those things because, if you're a multinational organization, and you're dealing with multiple countries, and each one of those countries is concerned about sovereignty and therefore creates a whole new set of rules and standards that are different from every other country. Now it's a very difficult operating model. Number one, so this is from the perspective of the corporation. Flip that around and you've got the perspective of these individual countries saying, I don't care about what your policies are. This is the way you're going to operate in this country, if you operate at all. So it's a real challenging dynamic.
So if Europe goes one way, for example, and the US goes another on standards and compliance, what does that mean for a company that's trying a multi-year quantum program?
So it's not unusual today for a company to have to deal with multiple different types of, scenarios in different regions. The challenge is with something that's so immature. When you've got a technology like quantum, where it's got 10 different modalities, a really uncertain path in terms of cryptographic standards, as well as language barriers and, all sorts of other things, it becomes a real challenge. And we're only starting to see organizations outside of the megas like, Google and Amazon and Microsoft and those who are starting to have to deal with those thresholds. And they're finding it a big, big challenge. They have to partner where possible. Now, from a sovereign perspective, you're assuming that within inside your country, you have those capabilities. You have vendors that are doing the things that you need to do from a sovereign perspective. But there's also a challenge in investing. Do those, national companies within inside the borders have the skills? Do they have the resources? Do they have the money in order to get to the level that you need them to? So I would say we're in a real chaotic kind of era in terms of quantum technologies.
Yeah. And that kind of brings me on to something that we talked about is roadmap. And roadmap years, because I think that kind of segues quite well into that. And I know you've talked about 27, 29, 30 as pivotal years.
Yes.
Walk me through that calendar.
So, obviously the conversations I have with corporations or scale ups about quantum roadmaps start now. But beyond that, they ask me the question, okay, so, am I talking 5, 10 years in the future? Well, the 2027 mandate tells the world that you need to start thinking about your cryptographic standards. You need to start thinking today about your most important data, how long you have that data need. So I think the last time we talked a little bit about harvest now, decrypt later. That is not a quantum phenomenon. That is a classical system phenomenon. So it's happening today. We know the companies are out there harvesting data, whether through hacks or other things, to hold on to your data pending a quantum cryptographic fault-tolerant computer. And when they have that, then they can decrypt it. Now, if that's 20 years from now, that's less important because data becomes less relevant. If it's 2 years from now, that's a significant challenge. And if you think about what Google has talked about in terms of its 2029 roadmap to have, essentially a fault-tolerant quantum computer by 2029, that's only 2.5 years away.
It's only 2.5 years away.
Right. And so you start thinking, okay, well, maybe they'll reach that milestone. And then all of a sudden, if Google has a quantum computer, that's one thing. But if a bad actor has a quantum computer, that's a very different thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. It's quite scary, to be fair. But I suppose if you're a business leader listening today in 2026, what should be already on your roadmap so you're not caught flat-footed by 2029?
Yeah. So, I would say, number one, understand what your business objectives are. Start with that. Number two, if you don't already have somebody on your team who is at least quantum curious, if not a dedicated quantum lead, start putting that person in place so that they can start doing the combination of those two things, your business priorities and what's happening in quantum, because it's not just the negative part. There's all sorts of, competitive edge opportunities that companies could take advantage of. Just yesterday, D-Wave announced that they were working with AT&T in a much more robust way than they had been doing already in the past, achieving some results. And so AT&T is going out to the world saying, we believe that combination of annealing and gate-based systems that D-Wave has are going to be very valuable for us in the future. And it's going to give us a competitive edge because we can do things faster. We can do things with more parameters. And so companies who are unaware of these competitive edge changes really need to be getting on board. And the benefit here today, Amir, is that there's no shortage of resources.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of available information.
Isn't it funny that a few years ago, D-Wave was considered an outlier in the quantum community, and now all of a sudden they're kind of going, oh, actually, there's a lot of value here. Hence AT&T.
Well, and it's funny you say that because, purists in the quantum community said that annealing is not really quantum computing.
Exactly.
Despite the fact that they were showing results and they've been around since 1999. But they've proved themselves. They focused very clearly on practical applications, of which they have over 250. Mm-hmm. And they've realized that there's benefit in gate-based quantum computing as well. So they're clearly making strong tracks. They've gone the public route. Mm-hmm. They've moved their office from Burnaby, BC to the US. And so they're becoming a global entity. Mm-hmm. Not to mention so many other modalities, whether it's based on, neutral atoms like Q-era, or photonics or other, sort of capabilities.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned obviously talk about the boardroom, and there's something that I've seen get a lot of traction now, and it's something I've been talking about, and you and I have certainly been talking about, and it's that translation gap and the boardroom. And you've talked about it quite a lot, about the real shortage of quantum communicators, people who can speak plainly to CFO, CTO, CSO, whatever it is. Why is that skill so scarce, and why does it matter, and what should be done about it?
Well, so, I've been involved in this industry for years, but I still have the same challenge whenever I meet up with a new CEO or a new group of people. I have to explain why they should be interested. Mm-hmm. And I only have 30 seconds to do it. So I need that 30 seconds to get them interested so I can have the next meeting, right? Whereas some people who are involved in the quantum world want to tell you everything that they know about quantum technologies in depth, and demonstrate how smart, how experienced they are, or how, relevant quantum technologies are. Yeah. And that's not the communicator that, is needed. You need someone who understands the fact that they have some business priorities and your quantum technologies may have nothing to do with those. Or if you start thinking about, okay, what are your risk challenges? I've got a conversation next for you. What are your competitive edge opportunities? Are you doing anything in terms of optimizing portfolios or optimizing traffic flow or optimizing your life science, cancer research? Mm-hmm. All those have opportunities. So when it comes to a communicator, less is more at the beginning. Make a compelling argument as to why you should have an additional conversation and then get that next meeting versus, recount the history of quantum physics.
Yeah. I know you also did a podcast focused on entirely on boards and when mm-hmm. quantum reaches board level. what are directors potentially getting wrong right now, and what do they? I suppose this follows on from the last one. And what do they need to hear most?
So directors have a pretty broad accountability list. So whether that's to investors or to risk management, or to simply longevity. And so they're looking at all of those aspects at the same time. And so what's critical is that the messaging that comes from the quantum industry is that your solutions uh, respect those requirements, are going to respond and support those goals going forward. So as simple as that took in, the last 30 seconds to explain it, any board member would go, okay, I'm
Yeah.
ready to hear more.
Yeah.
Right. And so, when I talk to board members, they are concerned about preponderance of things. And so, fitting quantum in, whether it's from a budget perspective or from a technology implementation perspective, because they've been aware of digital transformations that took 2 to 10 years. How do they now start rethinking their technology? And, it's, if you can flip it around and tell them how exciting the possibilities are, all of a sudden becomes, okay, so we don't need to solve for it this month, but we sure do need to have a nice 3-year roadmap, and no longer than 3 years in this, because the technology is changing so quickly, to have a 3-year roadmap for our business.
And this is the gap exactly where your work sits. So QSI and Brian Lenahan. So what does working with you or QSI look like in practice?
So from a QSI perspective, we want to make sure that people have resources, free resources that are available to them through our website, through our management team, people going to conferences, to get access to, that general information. Where I come in is in a specific consulting arrangement. So company comes to me and says, either, Brian, we're in the quantum industry, we're having a challenge communicating. We need to be able to tell our story better. Or you're a potential user of quantum services, and you need to start thinking about how to integrate those capabilities in future, whether it's because your consumers or your suppliers are pushing you in that direction, or you see a competitive advantage. And it's a technology set that is so complex, or perceived to be so complex, that they don't have anybody internally to make that happen.
And you've been in this space for a while, and I know you're getting busier and busier and busier. How's this year panned out for you so far? And why are you getting so busy? What is the demand?
Well, I have to tell you, I love the energy that I get out of this industry. You swing your legs out of bed in the morning, you've got something exciting going on. Could be a consulting engagement, could be a podcast that's coming up, could be a chapter of a book that you're writing, could be a TED talk. And so there's so many diverse things that are going on, and yet I can still set my own schedule. Somebody at my stage of life, it's very important for me to balance family, to balance, hobbies, as well as this kind of business. So I'm able to keep a schedule that is fully my own and autonomous.
I remember we talked about this previously, probably offline, and I love the model, the independent model that you built on your terms. And it comes back to when we were talking about, you've got a book coming out, which I think is your 9th?
Yeah, this will be number 10.
10th, that's it. And we talked about you turning down publishers to keep control, etc. So I love that. So I suppose someone early in this field, you've played the long game. I suppose, tell me why.
Yeah, because I look at it from the perspective of I'm the age that I am today, but I could be doing this for another 20 years. And so how do I structure a kind of business that can operate for that length of time, without having the complexities of an operating business, without having employees, without having, major advisor groups on the outside. How do you create a business that is somewhat isolated and independent? You make sacrifices with that model. You definitely do. Going with a publisher might have made it more mass scale. But that wasn't my priority.
Yeah.
Creating a consultancy that has hundreds of employees, a boutique firm, also a possibility, but a great deal more complexity than I'm willing to take on today.
Yeah.
So for me, I could be doing this in my current model for the next 20 years.
Wow. No, we talked about publishing, so it's only fair that we talk about Quantum Strategy, which is your 10th book, apologies. And I do believe it's coming out in October. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, what I wanted to do was accumulate all of the work that I had done over the last 7 years, because it's, a composite of my previous books, my over 400 Substacks that I've written since 2022.
That's a crazy amount. It really is. But they're all fantastic. I subscribe and I read them all because it's the knowledge, isn't it? But yeah.
It is. And, being able to explain a very complex technology set in a common language for business leaders, business professionals, to me was my goal. And because that's the environment that I came from, as we talked about in our last session. And so what I wanted to do was accumulate all of that into Quantum Strategy, the definitive guide, bringing people who are coming on board to the quantum environment for the first time. Maybe you're a board member, maybe you're somewhere on the C-suite or the management team, or maybe you're just even a professional, or you're a physicist or, somebody in the quantum vendor community or research community who wants to understand what it looks like on the business side of what you're trying to sell. So that combination of audience to bring together all of my work from the past.
Yeah. So this kind of circles back to something which I wanted to come back to. We've already mentioned it, is the quantum translator. That's what you are. In many different ways, with the podcasts, with the books, with the webinars, and so on. And the reason why I read your Substacks is because it's so informative for me, and it's one of my knowledge. Good. It's how I learn. We're going to need a lot more of those. How would somebody consider becoming or getting into that as a translator? Who should consider it? What should they do to become that kind of person? And who shouldn't consider it?
And you know what Yeah. And, you run into these people all the time, I'm sure, of very diverse backgrounds. And so what I would say is, you need to take the area that you're most passionate about, but be spending a lot of disciplined time trying to understand the things that you're not so experienced in. And so, for example, my background was, as we talked about before, in banking. And so, the key aspect or passion that I had there was, I was the business lead on these technology projects, and it was so important to me to be able to explain the technology project to the C-suite, to the organization that I worked with, so that they understood why it was a priority and how we could execute on it. That was my passion. But I didn't necessarily understand the underlying technology. And so from a quantum strategist or communicator perspective, I had to spend years understanding what quantum really was and what was hype, what was not hype, because you could clearly get called out. I write LinkedIn all the time. People can call me out on LinkedIn publicly and say, Brian, that's not true. So I need to be prepared in terms of what I'm saying. So for others, maybe you're a marketing whiz, maybe you're a great engineer, taking those passions and skills into a quantum communicator, it's possible if you are willing to spend the additional time understanding the technology and then understanding where your gaps are. And it's a very robust kind of role, if you can encompass that into one person.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, another thing I want to talk about this year, we've seen quite a lot of money coming into quantum, billions and billions and billions. So it's kind of
Yes.
raised its profile. And I've seen
Mhm.
people from a recruiter perspective kind of coming, oh yeah, I'm going to start looking at that, which has its own challenges. What are your thoughts on how this year's gone from a funding perspective?
Well, it's interesting because if you go back to 2023, there was a lot of venture capital moving into the industry. By 2024, the move was really to governments. What's happening in 2026 is you're seeing three different areas. You're seeing government investment, you're seeing public activities, whether it's through direct to public or SPAC, special purpose acquisition companies, and through venture capital seed rounds. And so we're seeing each one of those, and in large numbers, whether it's, 8 or 9 figures. And that is happening on a regular basis inside 2026. And so, it's phenomenal to see those kind of resources coming in. I think one of the next things we may see, Amir, is there's a huge number of companies in the space. It really blossomed. So I think we're going to start seeing some mergers and acquisitions.
Okay. Yeah. So there's been quite a few unicorns, as they say, popping up this year, which is great. What I'm curious about is that's all seems to be in the quantum world, for want of a better way of putting it. How is that when is that going to start trickling into the wider industry, different industries?
Well, so I think we have to be clear. Quantum technology will never be 100%
Mhm.
of computing technology.
Yeah.
It just won't, right? I mean, 90% of what we'll do in terms of computing in the future will continue to be classical. And so we're only really looking at the hardest possible problems that quantum technologies are going to solve. It's critical that we have that capability.
Yeah.
And so, what we need to do is take that 10% and make it scalable. And that scalable can either be scalable of an individual solution to a larger market, or scalable for an individual solution to more of those challenges, whether by industry. And so that becomes more marketable, more efficient, more attractive to organizations to have that happen. And so, I see that question of scalability becoming increasingly more important. Doing unique research in the lab has always been interesting,
Mhm.
but it's too small scale to be really commercially viable. So I do see in 26, 27, 28 to really start seeing companies that are focused on scalable capabilities.
Amazing. Amazing. So the world's looking pretty positive for quantum and QSI.
So I think so. I mean, we're going to be busy. And, the reason why I think that is not from a hype perspective, but because I see things like error correction, which is a key facet of quantum computing's capability, where you compare the number of logical qubits to physical qubits. So the things that keep that quantum computing processing. And there's a goal in quantum computing called break even.
Yeah.
Where you have the same number of logical qubits as you have physical qubits, and all of a sudden you're in a much more effective, cost-effective room. Today, last year we were at 1,000,000 physical qubits to 1 logical qubits. Today we're around 10,000 to 1. In a couple of years we'll be at 1,000 to 1. So that's an incredible iterative progress in a short period of time where people said, no, we'll never have quantum computers until 2035.
Exactly. It was always 10 to 15 years away. All of a sudden the timeframes have shrunk significantly, haven't they?
Exactly right. And so that's another thing that, I see as a reason for an expectation of a quantum computing future.
Fantastic. Brian, thank you so much for session number 2. We're definitely going to have session number 3 later on in the year.
Fantastic.
So obviously with all the work that you do, and I assume you're just going to get busier and busier based on what we're saying, where should people find you again? What's the best way for people to work with you?
Yep. So people can find me on LinkedIn, Brian Lenahan. You can also find me on the quantumstrategyinstitute.com, just like it says.
Yeah.
My consulting company is Aquitaine Innovation Advisors, and I do a lot of work through that. But you can also find me at Quantum's Business Substack. We've got thousands of free subscribers who can join us at any time. And again, that's Quantum's Business Substack.
Fantastic. And obviously you've got Quantum Strategy coming out in October. How can people get their hands on that?
All of my books are available on Amazon, amazon.com, amazon.ca, just by typing in Brian Lenahan books.
Fantastic. Brian, once again, thank you so much for your time. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And hopefully we'll get to speak again in another couple of months.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amir.
That's it for this episode of Beyond the Bit Quantum Pathways. If you found it useful, follow and subscribe wherever you listen and share it with someone working in quantum or emerging tech. And if your organization is hiring in quantum, you can find us at QAI Talent. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.